Senior Policy and Advocacy Lead from Safe World USA. On behalf of the Civil Society Coalition on Human Rights and Counter-Terrorism, welcome today to this side event, which is co-hosted by the Permanent Mission of Canada and the Permanent Mission of Switzerland. This event builds off the launch of the global study in June here at the UN. Today, we're going to discuss avenues for implementation of the recommendations from this study. So I hope this will be a really dynamic panel. We have participants from all around the world. We have panelists from the UN, from member state side, and from the civil society side. I'm going to hand over to my virtual moderator in a second. But before I do that, let me just give you the quick run of show. So we're going to first have some opening keynote remarks from the Special Rapporteur, Fionnuala Ní Aoláin. And then following from this, we'll hear some opening reflections from Ambassador Bob Rae. We'll then move to a moderated panel discussion, and then we'll have a number of interventions from the floor here and from the virtual floor online. We're hoping there's still some space for some discussions and question and answers, so please have ideas and have questions ready. But until then, let me pass over to Nikita to introduce herself and introduce the panel.
Hello, good afternoon from the online world. My name is Nikita Kusenikova. I'm the Executive Director of the Association Connect based in North Macedonia. We are members of the CSO Coalition, and we also led the regional consultations from the global study for Central and Eastern Europe. This event today is co-sponsored by the UN Special Rapporteur on Promotion and Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, the Permanent Mission of Canada to the UN, the Permanent Mission of Switzerland to the UN, and the CSO Coalition on Human Rights and Counter-Terrorism. And let me first give you a quick word on who the CSO Coalition is for those that maybe are not familiar with it. We are a global network of civil society organizations advocating for an end to the misuse of counter-terrorism measures. We push for greater protection of human rights and civic space in counter-terrorism responses. Our coalition focuses on multilateral norm setting and policy processes while connecting and supporting our members' work at national, regional, and international levels. Our coalition comprised of over 70 civil society organizations around the world, spanning human rights, peace building, humanitarian, and civic space focused organizations. And many members of the coalition helped lead and participated in the regional consultations for this global study, and you will hear from several of them today. The launch of the study back in June was just the beginning, and today's event will focus in on how we can move forward the findings from the global study and make meaningful progress on some of the recommendations. I believe this person sitting in front of me in the room does not need any introduction for anyone in the room or online. So without further ado, let me hand over to Fionnuala Ní Aoláin, the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Fionnuala, the floor is yours.
That working? It's working. Yay. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I actually feel it's like I'll come over. That might be better, easier to be seen. It feels like I've been saying goodbye for about 5 months now, because we said goodbye in a room in the Irish Embassy up the street a couple of months ago. But the vagrancies of UN appointments have meant that I've had an extra couple of months, and that's been really quite extraordinary, not least because it's given an opportunity to institutionalize the global study, which I see as one of the hallmark things that my team and I were able to do during the course of my 6 years as Special Rapporteur. I particularly want to thank the Government of Canada, Government of Switzerland, to Bob, who's been such a good friend to me personally, to our teams, for actually supporting today's event, but also to those member states who consistently show up for civil society, the member states who demonstrate by supporting these kinds of events, creating space for civil society here in New York, that it's not just a couple of words in a global counterterrorism strategy, it's about actually walking with, supporting, and responding to what civil society is telling us. The findings of the global study are multitude, but I do want to say a couple of things about what the study says. For those of you who haven't had a chance in your spare time to browse this, but also to say, aside from the study, for those of you who've gone online, you've seen it comes with what we call the digital experience, which is also a record, a video record, a voice record, an empirical record of the scale and substance of violations experienced by civil society from the misuse of counterterrorism globally. And one of the things that I was able to do this week at the third committee was to take the global study and memorialize it into the General Assembly through my General Assembly report this fall. And I think that's important because I think part of the goal of the study is actually to be institutionalized within the UN, taken up by UN bodies. And I'm really pleased that OHCHR are here today, one of my core partners in the work that we've done together. But it's not enough that human rights bodies are the ones saying that this work needs to be done. We need a profound shift from the counterterrorism architecture of the UN to actually also meaningfully, consistently, and in a sustained way, not just engage civil society, but actually address the issues that are manifest in this study. The global study was supported by 2 countries, the Kingdom of Spain and Germany, and again, without member states who are prepared to support this kind of work. Many of you know that the mandate works on a 0 budget, and you also know that civil society works on a 000 budget, right? And the point being that this kind of work, both the institutional work of documentation, the advocacy work, is done in the least supported part of the UN. And I say that because as this study documents the impact of counterterrorism, it does so in a profoundly unbalanced budget world, where the CT architecture continues to grow, but the support to civil society continues to fade, whether that's nationally, regionally, or globally. So let me just say a few things about the findings. And one of the things that we know is that I think the findings of this study are not abstract. What the study does, it directly demonstrates that the challenges, the direct harms, and the infringements on legitimate activities for civil society are concrete and they're sustained. And they are cross-regional. They are experienced in every part of the globe, and there's experience in societies that are democratic and some that are not. So there's a consistency to the challenges that we're facing. The other challenge the study documents is these harms are layered and they're cumulative, and they essentially prevent civil society from doing its vital work in many parts of the world. And in many countries, as this study documents, civil society faces an existential threat of extinction, meaning the scale of securitization and the harms being experienced by civil society actors literally make it impossible for them to do their work in a meaningful way. And we are all the losers as a result of that. The second thing I want to stress is this study was really a bottom-up effort, and it was led in many ways by the voices of civil society, and it was data-driven, because many of you know that some of us have been saying this a long time. There's misuse of counterterrorism, and I think that conversation has largely been at the margins of the UN. There they go again, those human rights people complaining about the misuse of counterterrorism. And we tick that box, we listened to them, and we moved on. And that's a kind of not a structural problem, it's sort of a tangential problem. And I think one of the things that this study sought to do was to reframe a debate about the scale of misuse of counterterrorism in a data-driven way. And so we had a participatory, civil society engaged, civil society led process. We had 12 civil society consultations across the globe, and some of my team, some who work for me now, some who used to work for me last year. So I want to welcome both Adriana and Elisa here. We traveled the globe to engage directly with civil society where they were at. So, and to make sure that we were reflecting in the study what was being experienced on the ground. We had 108 written inputs by 76 organizations, 76 civil society organizations, and we had a number of online surveys in multiple languages. So all of that to say that the data scraping both in person, but also the sort of depth and scope of data that drives this study, I think should put to rest the idea that this is a marginal problem. This is a structural problem with counterterrorism. It's a DNA problem with counterterrorism. And unless we fix it, we're not just dealing with a human rights problem, we're also dealing with a security problem. Because when you target civil society, you're doing lousy counterterrorism. You're doing ineffective counterterrorism. You're actually likely to be creating the conditions conducive that produce violence in a society. So we have to ask ourselves some profound questions based on the data from this study that actually it requires action. Three other highlights I want to stress for us. One is that the nature of the harm experienced by civil society is often layered upon existing harms for civil society groups. And I think one of the things that this study did consistently was look at the pervasive and evidenced discriminatory aspects of PCVE and CT. And in particular, the use of CT measures against religious, ethnic, cultural minorities, women and girls, LGBT and gender diverse persons, indigenous communities, and historically marginalized against groups in society. So if you take persistence, complex, compounded misuse, and you layer that into structural discrimination in multiple societies, again, I say we have a structural problem that requires a range of solutions that are not simple, but are absolutely necessary. I also want to say that the study does one other thing, and I see Nikita, I see so many of our partners here in the room, is that it demonstrates the resilience of civil society. There is nowhere, even in the most difficult spaces that we went to, in countries where civil society is literally legislated out of existence, unable to open offices because CFT measures are being used against them, hunted down, literally the number of human rights defenders being killed every year in some countries, as well as the targeting and detention of civil society actors. And yet, even in those places, we see civil society functioning. We see them working against the hardest odds in the most difficult of circumstances. And that speaks all the more to our obligation, particularly for the UN actors in the room, to support them as well as member states. Let me close by saying there's a whole bunch of recommendations in this study. And I want to just highlight a few. To member states, we have to practice what we preach. If we say you cannot target civil society, that means you have to call it out when it's happening. When countries can shut down entire civil society sectors, then you have to name that as abuse, not just because it's the right thing to do on a human rights basis, but it's actually a terrible security move to actually quash that piece of society that is your natural partner and ally in prevention. I would also say that we need monitoring, oversight, and accountability for misuse of counterterrorism. That is national, that's regional, and it's also global. To the UN, I would say, as I depart in the next month or so, I would say the UN we've had some significant leadership, and I want to commend, I know we have Canada, we may have Tunisia, we may have Spain and Oman here, countries who committed in the global counterterrorism strategy review process to engaging civil society in a meaningful way and defending their right to be in the space, as well as preserving language in a context where many states don't want that language in the resolution at all. But the UN itself has to step up. We can no longer tolerate the misuse of counterterrorism with a free pass. And the reality is when Rio and I and other human rights actors in the system call it out, everyone expects us to call it out. And frankly, a lot of the time they ignore us because we're human rights people, and that's what we say. But it requires, frankly, the counterterrorism bodies in the UN system to actually live up to the promise of the GCTS, to hold states accountable, to be more transparent in what they do, to engage civil society meaningfully. And that that means not inviting gongos in and pretending they're actually independent civil society. It means protecting them when they show up in New York. So if they are reprisals, that you name it, and we've seen that already. And it also means that we have to stop this nod and wink culture, that what states do in the CT space, they get a free pass on, and in the human rights space in Geneva and through mandates and OHCHR, that we call them out in that space only, because actually that's a free pass. And that culture is the culture that prevents fundamentally grappling with the harms of sustained counterterrorism misuse against civil society. So I'll stop there and just say, I really hope that this isn't a book stopper for a door, that we actually will use this study to do the work that's needed to prevent, support, and protect civil society going forward. Thank you all.
So much to pick up on from your remarks, but I mean, maybe just two things. The not viewing the human rights impacts of counterterrorism as unintended consequences when they're happening repeatedly, I think is a key thing coming out from the study. And then being able to actually call out when these things are happening, and the UN system having a responsibility to be impartial, but not neutral. And I think sometimes that line is crossed. And so, thank you so much for your leadership on this. Ambassador, let me invite you up to the podium. I'd love to hear your reflections. I think everybody in this room is well aware that the ambassador was the co-facilitator of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy Review process, but maybe some online might not. But really keen to hear your views from your spot. Thank you, Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much for the chance to join you and for the chance to participate in one of the longest farewell tours I've had the pleasure of watching over a while. Certainly longer than Rolling Stones. It's gone on for quite a while. Fionnuala, let me first of all just thank you personally for what you have done, because I think I would, without overdoing it, I would say that you have shown everyone what a commitment to the truth, a passion for what you're doing, a desire to just do the right thing and say the right thing all the time. I think you've shown us all the possibilities of what a really good mandate holder can do, because you have definitely held a lot of feet to the fire, and over a long period of time, in a way that I think it's really quite remarkable, and entirely commendable. As has been mentioned, I've had the pleasure of co-facilitating the latest global counterterrorism strategy, and had an opportunity to work with Fionnuala and her team in a way that I think was really quite wonderful. And I know it's frustrating working in the context of consensus and working in the context of states parties that have many different and competing and very different views. And I think we've been able to make some incremental change. And I've seen one other aspect of your advocacy, which is that you're working in the system, and you know that you have to live with that. You're not a totally free agent. None of us are. We all have to work with our governments, and able to share comments on the limitations of both the organizations from which we work. But I also want to thank you for inspiring this coalition, a group that has been a very valuable source of advice to me, to my team, and I think, frankly, to the whole membership of the UN, as we seek to ensure something that is really quite fundamental. That is that the counter-terror work that the UN has agreed needs to be conducted in response to terrible global events that are taking place, that it has to be in line with our collective human rights obligations. I can remember the debate that unfolded after 9/11 in my own country. I had just come off being, for 6 years, being a member of the Security Intelligence Review Committee, which is our own oversight body of the Naval Intelligence Service. And I can remember one political leader, not single him out, but making a point of saying that what happened at 9/11 was a game changer for the whole structure of the rule of law. But maybe there were a lot of assumptions about habeas corpus and other things that had been built into our system. Maybe we needed to think those over again. And I can remember saying no, because the whole purpose of fighting battles, in this case against terrorism, is not that you mimic the terrorists, but that you follow the line that says, well, now we can throw all these inconvenient civil liberties out the window, because after all, we're fighting for a much bigger picture. I think that most global leaders during war understand the line that they have to walk, demonstrate that in fact they're different people that they're fighting against. This is a line that continue to hold itself. I think the global study is remarkable. I think it's in depth. I think the description of it, its scope and its depth, quality of its research, the extent to which it's driven by data, driven by facts, as much as humanly possible. And I think the groundbreaking way that a commitment to gender equality and women's rights was built into the consultation process itself, it was just remarkable. And I think that's something that should also, of course, change, not only in governments, but also the way the UN does work. You don't shy away from difficult issues. In every one of my meetings I've had, we've always ended with a tough subject. And I've gotten to recognize that, okay, this is sort of the price of admission. We're going to have to deal with some difficult issues. And I think you've done it here again, when you notice that you pointed out that Islamophobia sometimes linked to CT legislation in many countries. And I note that the study sees this as an issue in Canada, that impacts the trust that some Muslim women have police forces. We need to hear that, to know that. We need to be able to share that with our governments and say, here's a problem we need to work on. And I think it's quite remarkable that we need to be able to do that. I also notice positively, I might say, that Canada is one of a limited number of countries where the Attorney General now has a reporting obligation to Parliament to see if new counter-terror legislation is consistent or inconsistent with our human rights and charter obligations. And now, of course, in Israel, on October the 7th, such a short time ago, we have seen one of the worst terror attacks in history, carried out by Hamas, by non-state actors, and the very real and ongoing threat of terrorism, even in countries who are best prepared to deal with the threat. So we think that sometimes people say, well, terrorism, that was this, that was that. We say, no, we're still living with it, we're living with the consequences of it, and living with its genuinely traumatic impact on the civilian population. And so this is why I think we need to look forward to hearing the advice of people on the panels relating to the findings of this study and relating to what our work is ahead. I'd like to thank the CSO Coalition and the Special Rapporteur, both for the report itself and for bringing us together here to further deepen the impact of the study. I think it's important. I mean, I continue to plug forever. And I certainly don't want you to disappear from our ranks in coming back and telling us what to do. The fact that you will not have this official position for very much longer, you say, that is doesn't mean that you're too far away from it. But I wouldn't want that to happen. Anyway, thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, the Ambassador, and thank you for your clear commitment to the issue of protection of civic space. And now I will invite the panelists in the room to come in the front and take their seat while I introduce our three panelists for today. First, we have Ms. Tanya Bulakovsky, who is a legal researcher at MENA Rights Group. She litigates cases of human rights violations before international human rights bodies and conducts legal and policy research on human rights related issues in the MENA region. She leads MENA Rights Group's research on counter-terrorism issues and transnational repression. The second panelist is online, Ms. Rama Ramadan, who joins us virtually from northern Kenya. She is a lawyer and a research fellow at the Center for Human Rights and Policy Studies, a Nairobi-based think tank that works on security, justice, and human rights in Africa. She has been extensively involved in governance and violence prevention initiatives in the East and Horn of Africa and has advised on regional and international policy on governance in peace and security. And our third panelist is Mr. Rio Hada, Chief Equality, Development and Rule of Law Section at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Mr. Hada leads the thematic engagement of OHCHR to mainstream human rights in intergovernmental and interagency discussions in New York. He chairs the Global Compact Working Group on Human Rights, Rule of Law, and Victims of Terrorism. Thanks to the panelists, and Jordan, I give the floor to you.
Thanks, Nikita. So Tanya, you have a microphone already, and then here there's a microphone there for you. I'm going to start with you, Tanya. So you've had the great reflections from Fionnuala, from the Ambassador. How does that resonate with your work, being a civil society activist and researcher, researching these issues in the MENA region?
Hello, thank you so much for both your interventions. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in today's event. It's an honor for me to be a part of this panel. So my name is Tanya Bulakovsky. I'm a legal researcher at MENA Rights Group, a Geneva-based legal advocacy NGO working on defending and promoting human rights in the Middle East and North Africa. We had the privilege of co-facilitating the MENA regional consultation for the global study, which marked the first time civil society actors from almost every country in the region were consulted to provide their invaluable inputs. So the topic we're discussing today is of utmost importance to us. At MENA Rights Group, a significant part of our work is to document cases of human rights violations, many of which fall under patterns of misuse and abuse of counterterrorism at the national level, but also at the regional level. The global study to us is a crucial step towards understanding the complex challenges faced by civil society in the context of counterterrorism. The recommendations included in the global study are extensive and address a number of actors, including member states, the UN, and civil society. So obviously, as a civil society organization, the latter are the ones that resonate with us the most. However, we believe that the global study recommendations are interconnected and should be understood and implemented holistically. The recommendations rightfully mention that counterterrorism practices require a fundamental transformation, and such a transformation cannot be achieved without all stakeholders working together. For example, the global study recommends civil society to continue to engage with UN treaty bodies and special procedures. We at MENA Rights Group are already monitoring and documenting the impact of counterterrorism on human rights and closely collaborating with UN human rights bodies in Geneva. However, it is our impression that the process stops there and that our concerns are not heard beyond Geneva UN bodies. This underscores a substantial gap between the realm of human rights and the realm of counterterrorism at the UN, and this gap must be bridged. Entities shaping counterterrorism policies must engage with entities working on defending and promoting human rights. One side cannot continue to unilaterally shape the global counterterrorism architecture without engaging in meaningful collaboration with those who understand the reality of the consequences of counterterrorism on the ground. Both worlds must really work together. The global study also recommends that civil society continue to engage in cooperative relationship building, which is undeniably crucial, but we cannot do it alone. All relevant stakeholders, including member states, the UN, and regional organizations, must establish accessible channels of communication with society and actively facilitate collaboration with us. We must remember that the global study only represents the tip of the iceberg. The misuse and abuse of counterterrorism measures and practices is a deep-rooted and systemic issue, and its impact is continuous and evolving. Addressing it cannot be confined to a one-time examination. Let us not forget that the objective of countering terrorism in the first place is to protect human rights. We really hope that this study will serve as a stepping stone toward bridging the worlds of counterterrorism and human rights and act as a catalyst for the transformation of the counterterrorism architecture, a transformation that we must jointly strive for. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tanya. Especially liked your point around inclusive policy making. So, you know, everybody knows the phrase, the wisdom of Crown, but policy making is the same. Policy making just by certain member states is usually not going to get as good policy as inclusive policy making with civil society. And, you know, we thank the ambassador and his team for showing us how to do that over the last few months of the global counterterrorism strategy. Now I'm going to turn to Mr. Haddada. So there's 13 recommendations in the global study for member states, but 8 for the UN. So the UN system's doing a little better. But looking at those recommendations in the global study, which of those do you see opportunities right now for the UN system to take forward some meaningful action and implementation?
Thank you. Well, I think Fionnuala forgot one recommendation, which is to increase support for the mandate. But congratulations once again to you and the team for the very seminal study. I think it provided us with really tremendous amount of evidence, data, and trends, and indeed rich recommendations, including for the UN system. And taking forward these recommendations to institutionalize the global study funding, let me share 3 thoughts for now, which I think are particularly critical for the UN system. The first is obviously on strengthening the civil society engagement. It goes without saying that civil society is not only impacted by CT measures, but they play a critical role in efforts to prevent and counter terrorism. But how much are we in the UN system really engaging civil society in a truly meaningful way, let alone protecting their space? So in this respect, the global study really offers critical insights and guidance on how the UN system can better protect and promote their engagement in the counterterrorism arena. And obviously for OSHR, the preserving and expanding the space for the critical voices of civil society is at the core of our priority. Under the UN Global City Compact Working Group on Human Rights, Rule of Law, and Victims of Terrorism, which I chair and our vice chair, Cecilia from our city is back there. The civil society engagement is a core objective of this working group, and we have regular briefings and dialogues with the civil society, but this needs to be more systematic across all of the working groups, not just the human rights one, and across all entities. And as you said to the member states, UN system also needs to walk the talk on having meaningful participation of civil society. The Global Compacts, I believe, offers opportunities to have that more discussions on the global studies findings and how we can increase that level of dialogues with civil society, and also to raise more awareness and advocate for civic space with the member states on the important role the civil society play as recognized in the global strategy. So second, there's a recommendation for the UN to have disaggregated data on the discriminatory and misuse of counterterrorism and PCV measures. And here we already have a good starting point, and that is the reprisal mandate of the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights and the annual reports of the Secretary Generals through which we have been documenting incidents of intimidation and reprisals since 2009. And the latest report submitted to the Human Rights Council last month documents laws and regulation concerning civil society, as well as counterterrorism and national security that are aimed at or have the effect of deterring or hindering cooperation with the UN. The report also documents, for example, the use of travel bans under the national security and counterterrorism legislation, which serves as a significant obstacle for civil society actors to cooperate and participate in UN meetings. So this is a specific mandate that OSHR has, but we also monitor the human rights situation across the globe. And other OUN entities may also be collecting data and information. But the value of the global study is that for the first time, it provides more comprehensive picture, providing us with a solid baseline to work on. So we need to find ways to institutionalize the follow-up and continue to update and share improved data in a more comprehensive but not in fragmented way. The third and last area I want to mention is the use of recommendations by human rights mechanisms of the UN. There's a wealth of guidance and recommendation out there, including country-specific ones. Again, under the Global Compact Working Group on Human Rights, Rule of Law, and Victims of Terrorism, we conducted a mapping of such recommendations in 2 pilot regions, one in Sahel and one in Central Asia. And these pilot metrics of recommendations are available publicly on the Global Compact portal. And we are hoping to expand the metrics to include other regions, which should inform not only the UN's technical assistance on counterterrorism, but also the broader UN country team strategic planning, common country analysis, and the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework. I'll stop here. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And now I will come to the online sphere and give the word to our colleague Rama. Rama, you participated in the East Africa regional consultations. So which of the recommendations presented in the global study resonated with you the most and are most relevant for your region?
All right. I don't know if you guys can hear me now.
Yes, we do.
All right. So first of all, thank you so much for having me and the entire CRIPS team into this discussion. We, the Center for Human Rights and Policy Studies, did lead the West, East, and Central Africa Civic Society consultation for the global study. And we did actually have a very rich discussion. And for the center, being a think tank that focuses on security governance issues, primarily we would look at data. So we were very much interested to participate in this study with the Special Rapporteur Fionnuala. And I think jumping onto just straight, what would the recommendations that were presented in the study resonate with me most and with the center? For us, the need for effective monitoring, oversight, and accountability of CT's impact on civil society, definitely. There definitely needs to be not only an increased goodwill as we've heard, but also commitment by building mechanisms to address the repercussions of security measures on organizations and human rights defenders. I mean, this recommendation particularly was crucial for us because civil society often struggle to find an inlet to regional accountability mechanisms and also treaty bodies and special procedure mechanisms. So, I mean, the global study is a crucial first step in terms of mapping out the complexities, the problems faced by civil society, and the comprehensive study does actually show evidence of the gaps. So for bodies that have questioned the very existence and depth of the effects of the misuse of CT laws, have an answer. So now that we have the data, we have the evidence, we must begin to demand for regional mechanisms, which for me would be an easier way, because the countries that do suffer this repercussions, can push this regional mechanism bodies. We must begin to demand for regional mechanisms to address situations in member states. Demand for accountability and implementation of effective accountability measures beyond the talk that we have been hearing all the time, and we go into meetings and discussions, and that's why we leave it as. The second thing for us would be, the need for member states to reorient military approach to taking into account evidence and strategies and resources that have led to considerable progress in peace-building initiatives. And I mean, this reorientation also must take into account and aim to strike a balance with fundamental human rights and freedoms, and of course the preserve of national security. I mean, without hiding under that as the reasoning for continuous violations of civil society. Mm-hmm. And for us, this is especially important considering the history of some states, and that has also contributed to how policing is done today. And in some jurisdictions, the institution of policing has been put to question by various civil society actors. And even that, where there has been clear guidelines on paper for security agencies and how they need to conduct themselves. The third thing is, the third recommendation is definitely establishment of transparent and effective mechanisms, accountability mechanisms for CT. And this particularly is also within the national context of member states, And I mean, it's evident how over the years, the overt nature of CT has led to misuse of counterterrorism policies and measures. This also coupled with the great this coupled with the absence of conclusive accountability mechanisms have greatly contributed to a shrinking civic space across the region. I mean, in some countries, we have seen kidnappings, we have seen enforced disappearances, we have seen cases of extrajudicial killings that have been reported, and more often than not, these cases continue to be reported as the years go by. And on the other side, there seems to be no one held to account on this. The third thing is very important for us as the center is supporting the survivors and victims of terrorism. Now, there has been much needed focus put on CT and PCVE measures in general. But now I think this recommendation particularly stood out to us and is an area of priority because if we are to not contribute to the cycle of not addressing the root causes of violent extremism and the complex problem that it is, then I think it's crucial to think about the immediate individuals also that host or support the victims and survivors as well, and the communities in which they live in. They themselves, together with the survivors and the victims, they do need extensive psychosocial support as well as livelihood support to a certain degree that, and this for us, and also it really came out in the report, has been quite minimal. So with those 4 points, I would stop there.
Thank you very much, Rama. I now give the floor back to Jordan, because I know we had several colleagues also who wanted to contribute to the discussion. Jordan?
Thanks, Nikita. So I have a list of some people who have signed up for interventions, and we're going to come back to our panel to give some reflections and engage with some of the things that you say from the floor. We're going to do it in threes, in person and then online, to make sure that everyone stays awake. So first, Anna Oosterlink from Article 19, who maybe I surprised by going first with, but Anna, over to you. And we have just about half an hour left, and we have 10 people to speak, plus going back to the panel. So do the math, and let's try and keep it at 2 minutes if we can.
Thank you for the floor, and thank you for organizing this session. I speak on behalf of Article 19, which is an international human rights NGO focusing on the protection of freedom of expression and related rights. And Madame Special Rapporteur, Fionnuala, I would like to start with your own words, which you have repeated, and I repeat everywhere I go. Security without human rights is meaningless, and human rights inherently protect and advance security. And we at Article 19 have been working for some years now to expose legitimate speech being criminalized, supposedly to tackle terrorism, but really designed to crack down on dissent and shrink civic space. We have documented internet shutdowns or the blocking of websites during elections or protests under the guise of national security, while effectively facilitating human rights violations and muzzling dissent. We have seen journalists and human rights defenders being targeted, with already marginalized groups such as the LGBTQ+ community particularly under fire. But I want to focus on one particular thing in this study that was really of great interest to us, and that is the growing interest in how to deploy new and emerging technologies to counter terrorism. And one example is biometric technologies, which is often deployed for mass public surveillance as part of counterterrorism. Now, these technologies analyze the way people look and act, for example, at border control and for advertising, and they profile people based on gender, skin color, and so forth. But they essentially change how people act in public, and they destroy their ability to confidently express themselves anonymously. And so they risk the very existence of civic space and democracy. Now, we've been doing all this work for some time, but I think this study really helps us connect some of the dots that we haven't seen, because we've been working on this globally from Latin America to Central Asia. And we can now connect the dots better to see what we're actually looking at. And we are very keen to keep working, and we see this study really as a stepping stone to further work. At the end of the day, just one personal word to the Special Rapporteur. It's hard to sum up all your achievements over the past 6 years, so I'll just stick with a simple thank you. And the thank you is for sticking up consistently for civil society. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Anna. Now can I hand over the mic to our other generous co-hosts, Christian.
Thank you very much. Good from here. Thank you. No, that's fine. Thank you very much. My name is Christian Wagli. I work at the Mission of Switzerland to the UN. Thank you very much to the CSO Coalition for organizing this event, and also to our colleagues from Canada for co-sponsoring this with us. And also thank you very much to the speakers for their really fascinating inputs and for the rich discussion that I hope we will have on their points. For us, the inclusion of civil society is always a very, very important aspect when we look at the discussions we have on CT measures, and we have prioritized that also in the review process of the global counterterrorism strategy. And we also try to continue to work on this in during our term on the Security Council. Just a brief question from my side. We have heard about the possibility to improve the linkages between Geneva and New York, and naturally that is an area that's very interesting to us. And I was wondering if maybe our panelists, I think it was Tanya that elaborated a little bit on that, could give us some further guidance or some further ideas of how we can strengthen that link and how we can translate that into action, because I think we very much agree that there are too many silos when we're discussing security and when we're discussing human rights. And it would be something that we would certainly be interested in to support breaking down these silos and enhancing the linkages between the two discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Can I invite CJ Pine from the US Mission to be our third speaker from the floor?
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you to all the speakers. And this is, we're really keen to see more momentum on the follow-up to this report. We were very pleased to include a submission from the US to the report. I had a question picking up on what Rama raised around the importance of monitoring and evaluation. And I wanted to ask about M&E at the programming level. And if we have time today, if any of the coalition members would be able to share any reports or evaluations that you all are involved in related to evaluations of CT programming and impact on human rights, or that's a topic that we could follow up on afterwards. And similarly, we'd be interested in dialogue with coalition members on the work on a results framework that was agreed to in the GCTS. And thanks to OHCHR for flagging the work that you're doing on disaggregated data and the matrix. I think that's really relevant to the results framework as well. Thanks.
CJ, it's up to you.
Thank you, Jordan. Here we have Catherine Tomaszewski from the Charity and Security Network, who led the North America consultations for the global study. Catherine, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, and a special thank you to the Special Rapporteur and her excellent team, the CSO Coalition on Human Rights and Counter-Terrorism, the Permanent Missions of Canada and Switzerland, and the panelists here today. My name is Catherine Tomaszewski, and I am the legal analyst at Charity and Security Network. The Charity and Security Network is proud to have participated in the global study by co-leading the Regional North America consultation, as well as separately facilitating input for the global study with approximately 30 civil society organizations globally. Based on our participation in the global study, today I'd like to emphasize two main takeaways. First, the global study is superb in outcome because of its process, which was inclusive, intersectional, participatory, and civil society engaged and led from beginning to end. It included extensive regional consultations and incorporated gender and critical feminist analysis into the study from the beginning rather than as an afterthought. The global studies methodology should, from here on out, serve as a blueprint for all of us going forward on how to conduct participatory and inclusive research to advance and protect human rights. Second, the global study highlights the diverse evidence of impacts of counterterrorism measures on civil society and also presents a way forward on how to incorporate the appropriate safeguards to implement counterterrorism frameworks in a way that avoids harm to civil society actors who play a critical role in preventing conditions conducive to violence and terrorism. All stakeholders should take charge to implement these evidence-based recommendations from the global study to protect and engage civil society. And as civil society, we should harness the global study findings to continue to advocate for stronger human rights compliance and more expansive civil society access in our own countries and across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And today with us online, we also have Steven Reimer from RUSI. Steven, can you hear us?
Hi, Nikisia. Yeah, I can hear you.
Hi.
Am I coming over well?
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Steven Reimer. I'm a senior research fellow within the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies at the London-based think tank RUSI. My work focuses on the financial dynamics of non-state threats to peace, security, and democracy, including the financing of terrorism, and that's the topic on which I'm going to focus these very brief remarks. The CFCS at RUSI was pleased to have the opportunity to contribute its expertise on countering the financing of terrorism to the Special Rapporteur's global study. Adverse impacts of our counterterrorism financing architecture on civic space, such as restricted humanitarian access and impeding legitimate nonprofit organizations, are well documented. But at RUSI, we have set our sights on a novel and worrying trend, whereby states have gone beyond restricting civic space generally through burdensome CTF compliance standards towards deliberately misusing CTF laws and administrative powers to suppress political opponents, watchdog organizations, protest movements, investigative journalists, and other perceived threats to their state supremacy. And we've documented dozens of such cases, including human rights lawyers and opposition leaders kept in lengthy pretrial detention on bogus terrorism financing charges, as well as peaceful protest movements which have been starved of crowdfunded donations through targeted asset freezes. And in many of these cases, I'd like to point out, it appears that the weaponization of states' financial intelligence units have been a crucial enabler of such abuses. And in implementing the recommendations of the global study related to counterterrorism financing, and particularly in line with its calls for greater accountability, the CFCS at RUSI offers its proposal for an establishment of an independent ombudsperson, which could be possibly based on the model provided by the 1267 committee. And to that ombudsperson, victims of such abuses and misuses of counterterrorism financing powers could communicate their concerns. This office would possibly be tasked with engaging with the offending state, as well as the Financial Action Task Force, which is the global standard setter on counterterrorism financing, towards considering such misuse of abuse in the context of mutual evaluation reviews, as well as the state's compliance with counterterrorism financing standards. And that's what we see as a key way forward in injecting consideration for human rights into the global counterterrorism financing system itself. So many thanks for your kind attention and for this opportunity to take the floor on behalf of RUSI.
Thank you very much, Stephen. We had the intervention also from our colleague Victoria from Nigeria, but she's experiencing connection problems. So we will include her, give her the floor if she manages to connect again. So Jordan, back to the contributors in the room.
So thanks, Nikita. I think next on our list is Adele from the Global Center.
Thank you. So, good afternoon and good evening to those joining online. Like Jordan said, my name is Adele. I'm a Programs Officer at the Global Center on Cooperative Security. I'd like to start by extending our congratulations to the Special Rapporteur and her team for a very comprehensive assessment of how counterterrorism measures have significantly contributed to justifying state violence, repression, and the erosion of civic space on a global scale. Today, I'm here to speak on behalf of the project team responsible for conducting a scoping study on independent civil society UN counterterrorism engagement, which is a collaborative effort between the Global Center and Rights and Security International, who's a member of the Coalition on Human Rights and Counter-Terrorism. At present, we're in the process of analyzing the results from the study's extensive consultations with over 300 civil society representatives, member states, and UN representatives, with the aim of having a final report available in early 2024. Our commitment has always been to represent the diverse spectrum of views, concerns, and recommendations from civil society, and to help ensure that this diversity is reflected in the study. The draft will be undergoing a review and validation by our advisory committee. As we undertake this effort, we look forward to continuing to work with the Special Rapporteur's team and with our partners to implement the recommendations from the global study that focus on improving engagement between civil society and the UN. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adele. I think we have two more online. If there's anyone else in the room that has a burning desire to speak as well, that didn't put their name forward at the beginning, we can go to next. But first, Nikita, let me hand back over to you.
Thank you, Jordan. We have with us also Solafa Magdi, the Egyptian journalist. So Solafa, are you with us?
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you and see you now.
Yes, I'm honored to participate in this event. I'm Solafa Magdi, an Egyptian journalist, human rights defender, and former political prisoners. And currently, I'm a fellow with the Tahrir Institute, where my mandate focuses on the condition of women political prisoners in Egyptian prisons. While counterterrorism measures are essential for maintaining security and stability, examining their effects on individual fundamental rights, it is essential as well. Currently, while the Egyptian regime claims to improving its human rights record, I regret to say arbitrary arrests continue, with over 200 people being arrested of political defenders and even soccer fans through last week, and all of this charged with joining a terrorist group. Unfortunately, we have also over 250 women political prisoners. Actually, this happens while the government claims to face terrorism and to face counter-terrorism, but in fact, counter-terrorism laws are selectively applied against Egyptian peaceful defenders. Today, Egypt becomes the big prison, and right now, prison counts raises to 169 prisons. These prisons are filled with thousands of journalists, thousands of defenders. All are frivolous charges accusing of joining a terrorist group and held in pretrial detention for years, like me. Actually, I spent nearly 2 years in pretrial detention. And by the way, to this day, I'm still accused in 2 ongoing political cases and charging with terrorism. Finally, I say that because if we need to know how you can help in improving human rights record in Egypt and to protect defenders and journalists as lawmakers or policymakers, as well as human rights NGOs, you can help in not allowing to the Egyptian regime to labeling the opposition as terrorists, because this allows it to control the narrative and maintain its grip on power, justifying oppressive actions like mass arrests and crackdown on civil society. By portraying the regime itself as a bulwark or defender against terrorism, it can cultivate international military aid and intelligence sharing. Last thing, by focusing on counterterrorism, the government can divert attention from economic equality, corruption, and social injustice. These tactics allows Egyptian regime to downplay calls for reform and accountability, because as journalists, as peaceful defenders, we are the ones who pay the price. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Solafa, for your intervention, just adding on what has been already identified in the global study and by other contributors. Jordan, I don't see the other persons. Probably they have connection problems, so I don't have them online at the moment. So I will give the opportunity for anyone else in the room for contributions.
Are there anybody else in the room that would like to ask a question of our panel or make a quick remarks? We already have quite a lot of questions, so if you want to throw another one on, you can. But otherwise, okay. So back to the panel. Tanya, we'll start with you. So we have a question about biometrics, interlinkages with Geneva, importance of M&E and any good M&E in programming. We had reflections on CFT. We had comments on the Independent Civil Society Scoping Mechanism project. So is there anything that you heard today that you'd like to reflect on, anything that's changed your mind on how you view the global study, or would you like to, and also offer the opportunity to respond directly to some of those questions?
Thank you so much. I think I'd like to touch on specifically on next steps that we look forward to, and this echoes, I think, the question that was kindly asked to me, specifically from the UN in New York. What can the UN in New York do to affect change? Thank you for asking that question, because I may say that's a question that civil society would like to be asked more often. So in general, we appreciate that UN counterterrorism bodies have increasingly emphasized the importance of complying with international human rights standards, particularly in light of Pillar 4 of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy, or GCTS. But as all speakers have mentioned, it's time to walk the talk. It's time to shift from policy to practice, and inclusion of civil society and compliance with human rights standards must extend beyond theory and become reality. As I mentioned before, as a human rights civil society organization, it is our general impression that while our concerns can be heard and received by the UN in Geneva, we're not heard by the UN in New York. We are the ones who see the reality of the impacts of counterterrorism on the ground. We see the breadth of the human rights violations resulting from the misuse and the abuse of counterterrorism policies. Every day, we continue to document cases of individuals who have been forcibly disappeared, tortured, or sentenced to prison because they were wrongly accused of terrorism, mostly in reprisal for peaceful defense. However, we remain excluded from decision-making processes. We have to be the ones knocking on doors, asking for our voices to be heard. And it seems to us that there is a unidirectional approach when it comes to UN counterterrorism's relationship with civil society. We feel we are the ones who have to initiate contact, not the other way around. And meanwhile, states with highly problematic counterterrorism frameworks hold the most prominent positions within the UN counterterrorism architecture and have direct channels of communication. How can we move forward from this unlevel playing field to more equal and balanced relations of collaboration? I think we should all ask ourselves this question together. Through our work on the MENA region, we have also become aware of that the misuse of counterterrorism does not only operate at the national level, but the issue of transnational repression under the guise of counterterrorism is increasingly pressing and must be addressed. Echoing the global study's recommendation to Interpol to address the misuse and abuse of red notices by member states, the MENA region faces a very similar and context-specific issue, where repressive counterterrorism laws and policies are not only impacting human rights nationally, but their reach is being expanded at the regional level. Over the past few months, we have tried to bring this pressing issue to the attention of UN counterterrorism bodies, but we don't know to what extent our concerns have been taken into account or whether any concrete action has been taken. At the same time, the UN counterterrorism architecture is offering collaboration and support to these regional mechanisms. So overall, it is important for the UN in New York to acknowledge that civil society plays an indispensable role in effectively monitoring and protecting human rights. And as long as civil society inclusion remains a formality or a box-checking exercise, the promise of compliance with human rights standards is elusive. Moving forward, it's essential that UN counterterrorism bodies just redefine their approach to civil society inclusion and participation in a collaborative manner. Civil society actors cannot be passive observers. We no longer have to fight to simply be given the opportunity to raise our concerns after counterterrorism policies have already put in place. Our voices should be heard at the design, at the implementation, and at the evaluation stages. We must be given the space to evolve into active participants in counterterrorism decision-making processes in order to shape counterterrorism policies in compliance and in harmony with human rights. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tanya. So we are back over to you for maybe some closing remarks from your side. One of the things that often happens in this city is new reports like this come out, and then each state or department picks their favorite thing that they were already doing and then presents it as the thing that they're going to work on. So tell me what from this study has made you think differently as OHCHR, and what are you going to be prioritizing in the next few years, and then maybe if there's any other reflections from the comments you heard.
Yeah, I think I'll try to answer some of those questions through this round. And I think one clear thing that's is very obvious, but we really need to break the silos. And to answer your comments about the divide, also from the Switzerland, this doesn't happen only in the counterterrorism areas. I've seen and I've worked on other areas. This is happening: development cooperation, SDGs, drug policies. And what have worked, I think there are three things I want to say on this. One, the UN human rights mechanisms. They issued authoritative recommendations, normative guidance, and essentially really bridging these two areas and two communities together that have been a tremendous help in bridging the divide. The second is the civil society. I think in all of these, in my experience, all of these areas, civil society played a tremendously important role, reminding governments on both sides and forcing them to come together to have a common approach. So civil society plays a very, very important role. But the third is that we all need to really go back to the ground, right? What's happening on the ground. And I think the global study does that. Because if you ask those victims, they don't care if their issue is discussed in the second committee or third committee or that committee. So I think what the global study does is really to elevate that imperative of us working together to address their rights in the counterterrorism actions. And here OSHR has been implementing a project called Model National Human Rights-Based Counterterrorism Responses, and through which we aim to develop tools and resources for all stakeholders, member states, UN, civil society, to really integrate human rights into member states' country counterterrorism strategies and policies, and to facilitate that meaningful civil society engagement. And thanks to the CSO Coalition for helping us with the online consultations earlier. The other thing that I wanted to say is related to accountability, and it relates to the questions from the gentleman there. We are hoping to initiate and develop, hopefully in time for the next 9th review of the GCTS, to have gender and human rights benchmarks as an evidence-based assessment and sort of common understanding of how we are making progress on integrating gender and human rights in our compact activities and actions. And this could be used as a starting reference to improve our technical assistance and engagement with member states under the GCTS, and also to enhance efforts to achieve a more balanced implementation of the strategy as human rights and gender cross-cutting across all the 4 pillars.
Great, thanks, Rio. Nikita, let me invite you to maybe ask the last question in our online room before we wrap up, and I'll hand the floor back to Fionnuala just for some final remarks. She has 2 weeks left in her mandate, so we have to get every ounce out of her before she goes.
Yes, thank you, Jordan. Rama, so we come again to you for some final thoughts, and maybe what do you consider are the next steps for the UN community in New York to make sure that what are the recommendations from the global study actually affect and make a change at national level? If you can just unmute your mic.
A hybrid event with us. Quite technical challenges. So, we almost got to the end without this, so we did very good. Rama, it looks like you may have frozen.
I think she's just unmuted. I see her on the video, but okay, now I think we can hear you. Rama?
Great, Jordan, I almost messed up there. So there was a question on M&E, and I think before I go to your question, I'd want to answer that. So CRIPS has done a number of evaluations, programmatic evaluations, looking at different policy documents. So the first one is an audit on the county action plan to some county action plans to countering violent extremism, to preventing and countering violent extremism. So within the Kenyan national context, a county action plan would be translated from the national strategy to countering violent extremism. And the national plan would speak, the county plan would speak to specific areas, the nuances to specific areas that we call counties in Kenya. So CRIPS embarked on an audit of some of these county action plans, and we looked at the level of citizen engagement in design and implementation and review of these county plans. And just to touch on some 3 takeaways that we had is political goodwill has been limited. And this is particularly important because implementation of the local plans is to be driven by local county governments and security agency representatives. So this is particularly important. And the second takeaway is non-state actors have very much taken the lead in doing PCVE work. To mediate limited funding, civil society has kind of restructured the way they do social economic projects in the counties to address the drivers of VE. So this way they're able to continue with preventive initiatives, given the lack of PCVE specific funding, particularly from local government, which ideally should be the one taking the lead on this at the local level. The third one is the third very good takeaway from the evaluation was operationalization of the county engagement forum. So this essentially would be the body that would see the implementation of the plan. And in some areas of the country, this has been in operation and also is currently working very well. And the composition of this body includes state actors, the representation from local government, and also the different categories of security agencies. Now, this is important because in these forums is where you have civil society members and even community members that are not necessarily part of any community group or any organization do voice their concerns and, call out government representatives on actions that the state has taken. And some of them do include CT measures. So this has been a good takeaway from the audit that we did. The second one is that CRIPS did an evaluation on also some counties that have reviewed these plans and have implemented second generation of these plans. The third one is a study that CRIPS is conducting, looking at accountability of Kenya's counterterrorism architecture. Now, this is an ongoing study, and we will be happy to share it through the CSO Coalition once it's available, it's made available, and also it's definitely will be put up on the CRIPS website. Now, just a side note is that Kenya is in the process of reviewing its national strategy to countering violent extremism, and the authorities have called for a public call for the public to put in input. So the findings from our different monitoring and evaluations will definitely be inputted in the call for the review. So now, briefly, let me speak to one aspect in which I think the UN community in New York needs to look at. At least from the East African region, we have seen that there is a changing funding and programmatic landscape of PCV initiatives, at least from the regional and national level in the East African region. Now, state security agencies are now seemingly more open to collaborating with development partners and local and hyperlocal organizations as well in designing PCV initiatives. And there's a bit of a shift because now you see a situation where there is an open collaboration between the development partners, between relevant state agencies that are tasked with overseeing and implementing PCV initiatives, calling out for funding in conjunction where the design is done with all of these entities on the table. I think this is very important for for us to know, because then it would change how we approach these issues. We have an opportunity to now say, this is where we want the money, this aspect is what we want money to be put on, and if you have a situation where you have state agencies that have previously been at loggerheads with civil society organizations, and there have been tension saying, we're opening the doors. We want to listen, and we want to actually try and see if what we're doing here is working. For us, it's really important, and I think we need to pay attention to this, and it needs to inform how we are seeking to operationalize the recommendations moving forward. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Rama. And Jordan, the final contributions.
Thanks, Rama. And just before we wrap up, I'll invite Professor Fionnuala Ní Aoláin back up to the floor. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. Thank you to the government of Switzerland and the government of Canada for co-hosting. Over to you, Fionnuala.
I'm going to be brief because I'm standing between you all and second lunch or coffee. I just want to say, for those member states in the room, I think you have an extraordinary resource available to you, and you see some of it on display here today. And your work and the way you think and do policy in this space will be enormously enriched if you invest in it and you bring it here. And I think we will make better policy. We will address some of the fundamentals of conditions conducive to violence, as well as addressing the misuse of counterterrorism in ways, don't fall into the gap, that serve you all. So the first thing I would close by saying is please learn from civil society. And we have had over the last numbers of years, the creation of this coalition is a gift to you. And I would encourage you to resource it, to support it, to help pay for it. Because if you want this resource, this is your best investment in counterterrorism. It will reward you 10 times over in terms of the prevention agenda, the efficacy agenda, and policy that is likely to make a difference in the long run. The second thing I would say is to the member states who are showing up consistently, thank you. Because it's your presence in this space and your support to civil society, including through the Global Counterterrorism Strategy Review process, the states who've led your consistency matters. And it's seen not just here in New York, but by all of those organizations online today. And I think that your showing up matters. And finally, it's just been a real privilege to be Special Rapporteur, to work with you all. So I am looking forward to a break. But I hope that the work of the last 6 years that my team and I have done will actually be like a little seed, that it's just going to grow and strengthen here in New York and elsewhere. So thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fionnuala, for all the work, for the global study, and for all the work of the mandate. From us online, I would like to thank everyone who joined us online and who contributed to the discussion. And I hope that the next time we meet, we can talk about the positive experiences in the implementation of the recommendations from the global study. And Jordan, I give to you to close the event in the room. Thank you.